and I'm looking at the night sky, right? And I'm looking at it from one vantage point. Because you can go a million light years away that direction and get a very different image of the night sky. If the Hubble Space Telescope was in a different location, looking from a different place, this image would look differently, right? But also, when you look at that image, is it all of the night sky? It is not all of the night sky. It is a specific cross-section of the night sky from a specific point of view, right? It doesn't make it any less true that it's a representation of the night sky, but you and I both know that it's clearly not the whole deal, right? So the nature of human limitation as observers is that this is all we can ever do with reality, is we can only represent it to one another. If I'm going to tell you about what my life is like, I will have to represent it. Do you see what I mean? I cannot just download the information to you. You can't just know what I'm talking about. I'm going to have to represent it to you. What are some ways that you and I can represent the world to each other? What are some representations that we give to each other? We talk, right? We have a conversation. I tell you a story. I use sound, right? I vibrate my vocal cords, and then it vibrates airwaves, and then it goes into your ears, and then your brain says, okay, I'm being communicated something. That's one way. What's another way that I can represent something to you? I can write it down, right? And then the light coming off of the paper will get into your retinas, and then your brain tells you, I'm looking at something. It's a representation of a story. What's another way that I can represent it? We say that, Maria? Yeah, you can listen, right? You can write a song, you can sing it, you can paint it. There's plenty of ways we can represent it. I can mime it, right? I don't have to do anything verbally. I can use my physical gestures. That's where people do interpretive dance, which not everybody gets, which it makes sense that not everybody gets it because it's dance, and we don't typically communicate through dance, right? But this is the point. We represent things to one another. This is part of the human limitation. If I'm to understand another being, I must represent it, right? It's the nature of human existence. So let this analogy of the night sky, let it serve for how we talk about past events, right? I must represent it. I can tell you about how I got my very first job, right? I have a job history that includes me selling stationery in Mitsuwa, right? Like, that happened, right? And this is the space that I'm inviting us into, that I think an honest reading of biblical narrative, it invites us to consider these differences, right? The image on the left of your image right here is using the medium of maximal realism. It is a light-for-light representation of where the lens was looking at, right? It is representing it in the most direct terms, right? But you could argue that Vincent van Gogh's painting actually creates an impression of the night sky that does things that the Hubble telescope cannot do, right? It's actually a lot of the correspondence of the color schemes, right? The way the palette of the little town overlaps with the blue tones of the night sky. They're distinct spaces. I know that one part is the night sky, and I know the other part is the town. Even though when you look at it, I don't know very many towns that look like that. You know what I mean? Right? But in many ways, they're part of the same world. There's the town, and then there's the night sky, but the color scheme matches so that it's as if they're of the same substance. So both images communicate very different things. They're both interpretations of the night sky, right? The night sky is a thing that exists apart from our representations, right? So to me, this concept is a helpful distinction. It's going to start the conversation for us. It might be a little difficult to grasp, but the more we talk about it, the more it begins to make sense, right? This concept of the difference of the reality versus the representations of the reality. When I'm given the Bible and I'm reading a biblical narrative, what I'm reading is an interpretation and a representation of the events, right? It is not the events, right? Having read the stories does not make me an eyewitness, right? I'm reading a representation. the choices they make in representation, right? Right? If I want to really show you the significance of a thing in a movie, how might I represent the significance? I might focus in and start to zoom in on a character, right? I might show a spotlight, right? I might actually zoom out and show you how a character is so alone, right? Those are all choices of representation. And the meaning is communicated through the medium, right? I took a cinema class when I was in high school, and then I didn't really take it. I didn't really read the book. But the book that we were supposed to read that I didn't read is called The Medium is the Message. There's a very important story being told in that textbook that I didn't read, and have read since. But there's that thing, the medium is the message. Same types of techniques and conventions can be used, but put to different uses in different representations. To and critiquing a movement of hyperrealism in art portrayals. You've seen these paintings where the painting is so realistic that it looks like it's just a person, right? And then we mistook it for realism, as if that was the thing itself, right? And what Rene Magritte did in his famous painting, which I told you last week, is it's a painting of a pipe, like a smoking pipe. And on the bottom, it says, this is not a pipe, right? It's a very realistic portrayal of a pipe, but what's written underneath in French is ceci n'est pas une pipe, right? It's not a pipe, right? This is a great quote because it's the famous pipe that it caused waves at the time among philosophers and how people reproached people from it, right? This is Rene Magritte. This is Rene Magritte, and this is a quote from him commenting on this painting. It says, the famous pipe, how people have reproached me for it, and yet could you stuff that pipe? No. Can you hear the Frenchman in him, right? You couldn't stuff this pipe. No, you couldn't. It's not a pipe. It's a picture of a pipe. It's a representation, is it not? Right? If I had written on my picture that I painted, this is a pipe, I would have been lying to you, right? Right? And this is a philosopher thing. This is an issue for philosophers and the artists, right? But the point still stands. That is not a pipe. It's a picture of a pipe. You can recognize it as a pipe, but you could not relate to it like a pipe. You cannot use it. You cannot smell the tobacco. You couldn't light it on fire and consume without consuming it, right? It is not a pipe, right? And when I'm reading biblical narrative, I'm reading words on a page. In fact, if I'm reading in English, I'm reading a translation, a representation of the original language on a page, right? And those words on a page create a mental narrative world. It creates a place for me to build my imagination, but I only have what I'm given, which means the narrative world in my mind is going to be directly related with what I know, with what I can understand, and relative to my perspective and interpretation of the author. So here's the thing. Regardless of the representation, there's a real world outside of it, right? There's a real world of events outside of the narrative world. If there's a representation of events, there's still the event, right? You can draw your own conclusions about your experience and your vantage point about that real world, but my way to it is through the representation. Right? So what biblical narratives do is they invite us into the narrative world. They interrogate our narrative worlds, right?
There's a relationship between what I think is true and what is being represented to me as true. And they invite us to see things from their point of view, right? I wouldn't know what the experience of an Israelite during the Egyptian occupation would be if I was an Egyptian, right? I don't know what it's like to cry out in the desert after 300 years and have the God of Israel hear it, right? Save through this representation. So what these narratives do is it works on us, and often in very subtle and indirect ways. And over time, they begin to shape our view, right? Like Brianne said, it interrogates our views and our feelings. And over time, there's an exchange of information between how I view the world and how the narrative world views the world. And maybe I might say, that's a really great way to look at it. And then I begin to view the world that way, right? And then we emerge after reading a really good narrative different, right? I'm actually changed through the reading of the word, right? Just like when I watch a movie that's really well shot and well written and well told, a story, afterwards I'm like, wow, that was a very good movie. It makes me think of some things differently, right? It makes me see the world a little differently. Or you can choose to say, that's a nice way that some people thought to tell the story. That's great. It's one way, right? I have a different take on the world, but that's one way to represent it, right? We could say something like that. That's an option for us as well. But what we're not going to do is be put in a time capsule, right? And sent back in time and then watch CCTV footage of the events of the Bible. That's what I don't have access to. I can't do that. I cannot watch the footage of the events of the crucifixion. What I have is the perspective of women who were standing at the foot of the cross because the disciples were not there, right? When I'm talking about what the original narratives of the empty tomb were, who's the first people to know about the empty tomb? It's the women who chose to continue to visit day after day after day and prepare the body, right? Where were the disciples? Hiding. And so they had to be told by the women, it's empty, right? And then the disciples, well, I have to see for myself. And then they run and they go check it out, right? Yeah, dead people don't rise. Whether that's 2,000 years ago or 2022, dead people don't rise. It's notable when somebody says that somebody's alive when they had been dead, right? There's the question of how do we know about the temptation in the wilderness? I've mentioned this in sermons when I've taught it. Nobody was with Jesus. So the representation of Jesus' time in the wilderness is coming from Jesus. And he's telling them why it's important, right? In Psalm 29, there's a raging storm coming over the Mediterranean. We labored over this psalm in the last semester of this thing, right? Psalm 29, there's a raging storm coming over the Mediterranean, and it's shaking the world, and it's really powerful. And it's the poetics of language saying that this person standing on a mountaintop watching a storm crash over from the Mediterranean, then up and down the coast of Palestine. This poet is saying, I experienced God by watching that storm. The power of God moving over his creation, the power of God that can cause the cedars of Lebanon to crack, that can cause the mountains of Sirion to leap like cows, right? And the person who wrote that poem, that is what he saw. He literally saw a storm, and the way he told it was that he saw God, right? So the same person, another person could look at the same meteorological event, at the same storm, and say, it actually moved south first and then went north, and then that's probably because of temperature differentials and pressure differentials, and that's why the storm went that way. True. Probably, maybe true, but very different representations of what happened, right? But this poet's representation teaches us to actually see the real world as a way in which God is working within it, right? That's the poem. So the title for the first 5 books of the Hebrew Bible is what? Torah, right? Torah, right? And Torah does not, we choose not to use the word what to describe Torah? We don't choose, at least in this class, we don't choose to use the word law, right? Because law represents it differently than how they represent it. What does Torah mean in Hebrew? Instruction, right? It gets translated as law because of the way that it went from Hebrew to Greek and then to Latin, right? That's why we get law, right? And then into English. But which, in one sense, the law is given within the Torah, right? That's one aspect. But fundamentally, the word Torah comes from the verb to instruct or to teach or to show, right? And it's what the father and mother say to the son in Proverbs 1 through 9, right? These proverbs are for instruction, right? Hear my Torah, hear my instruction. That's the opening sentences of Proverbs. Hear my Torah. And then the couplet is hear my instruction, right? We studied the poetic couplet. Torah and instruction are then being compared to one another, right? So how is it that the narratives about people a long time ago, how is it that Torah, that narrative, can become instructive for me? How? Right? How do the first 5 books be considered instruction by the people who collected them? This is how, right? The Torah is then inviting us to see my very experience of the world through the terms of the interpretation of the Torah. All of us are working and living by an interpretation of where on earth we are and what we're doing, right? On this flying space rock we call planet Earth, right? And we get all of our worldviews from multiple places. We're taught by our family. We're taught by our community. We're taught about what success looks like by our communities and our families and our friends and books and TV and the internet. And we're being shaped by ads, right? Right? I have a story of when, so I like to cook, and so I have some knives, like chef's knives. And oftentimes, every few months or so, I'll take a whetstone, which is what you use to sharpen knives, and then I will just sharpen every one of my knives for about an hour while I'm watching TV. This is a regular occurrence for me, right? So I sharpen my knives often. And when I sharpen my knife, I don't talk about sharpening my knife. I don't Google sharpening my knife. I don't say, hey everyone, I'm going to sharpen my knife, right? I don't do any of that. It's so natural to me to sharpen my knife. But so I start sharpening my knife, and then I pull up my phone and I go on Instagram, and I get an ad for whetstones, for knife sharpening stones, right? Our lives are being shaped from multiple places, right? That's how ads work. Oh, maybe I should buy a new whetstone. And I might buy a whetstone, right? And so we get all of our interpretations of what the world is about and what's important from lots of places. The particular narrative world of the Bible is inviting us to consider its particular take on the world, right? A teacher of mine, not personally because he was in the hospital by the time I came through the class that I would have taken with him. His name is John Sailhammer. John Sailhammer is one of the foremost scholars of the Torah. He was the first kind of rebellious teacher of Torah. He wrote a book called Pentateuch as Narrative, right? That was scandalous at the time, to call it like a novel. He basically was importing novel reading techniques into the study of Pentateuch. At his point in history, it had not been popularized to call it Hebrew Bible. It had not been popularized to call it Torah. They were still calling it Pentateuch. But John Sailhammer, he puts it this way. He says, the biblical authors, they take the raw material of language. Okay? They take the raw material of language and then they shape it into a version of the world of empirical reality. Right? So there's the world, and they take language and shape it into a version of the world. It's essentially linguistic structures that are adapted to conform to events in real life. The reader looks at the events in the narrative much in the same way as he or she would look at events in real life, which makes it easy to forget that we're not looking at words, right? Because it's meant to represent reality. But what we need to do as good readers is remember that these are words. This is not the event. This is the words representing the event, right? While there can be other avenues through which we can learn information about the real world of events beyond the text, they are not part of the text, right? Those other avenues are not a part of the text, right? If I'm considering the text, I must consider the text, right? And those outside factors are not controlled by the author of the text, right? With the narrative world depicted in the text itself. So whatever it may be said about the world behind the narrative, whatever is the real event that the narrative is representing, we cannot mistake it for being the same as the narrative, right? But the narrative is different from the world. The representation is different from the world. If I take a picture of myself, I am not the picture, right? You could not be in relationship with that picture, right? The textual world is different, but a version of the events as they took place, right? I'm beating this into the ground because we really need to get it, that when I encounter the text, it's a version of the world. It is not the world, it's a version of it. So this is very relevant when it comes to understanding, when we're reading the biblical text, what sorts of cultural backgrounds should I bring in, right? What sorts of historical backgrounds, cultural backgrounds would be helpful for me to consider or necessary, right? Do you remember encyclopedias? In our last semester, we called them the encyclopedias of production, right? And the encyclopedias of reception, right? So what we mean by that is that we have like a word bank. We have a bank or a bag of materials, right? If you tell me something and I have something that matches, it makes sense to me, right? But if we have different word banks, there's liability for miscommunication, because one word for you might mean something different for me, but I think I get you, right? That's the challenge. So the encyclopedia of production that an author works from might be very different from the one that I receive. So I'm trying to work with the author to merge and adapt and learn their encyclopedias of production and incorporate it into my own so that I can hear them on their terms. But there could be times where I learn something from somewhere, oh, here's what the Babylonians did, or here's what the Canaanites did. And I think, oh, that's very interesting that the Babylonians did that. And then we begin interpreting something in the textual world in light of something that the author was not considering, right? It's still true about the Babylonians and the Canaanites, but the reference point for the author might not be the Babylonians and the Canaanites. This is actually an issue for us in the stories of the Exodus as historians, right? When we're talking about Egypt and the Pharaoh, which Pharaoh were we talking about? Right? In the book of Exodus, the Pharaoh is not named, right? But some people have said to me when we're talking about Exodus, didn't Ramses do that? Where are they getting their encyclopedia of production from? The Prince of Egypt. In the Prince of Egypt, the Pharaoh's name is Ramses. And so they mistake it, right? And so for the author of Exodus, they don't intend for us to know which Pharaoh. Why might they not intend for us to know which Pharaoh? Why do they not? Why might somebody not get specific about which Pharaoh?
Continues for 300 years. They were under a Pharaoh.
Yes. So you might be able to say that for this author, every Pharaoh is like this, right? Every Pharaoh is like this. And then future, when you go into the New Testament, sometimes Pharaoh is mentioned, right? Sometimes Pharaoh is mentioned. In Revelation, there's a Pharaoh, but they don't call it the Pharaoh, they just call it the Egyptian, right? It's all a related thing. But what is a Pharaoh? It's a ruler. And what do we know about rulers? As far back as Genesis 1, is that rulers have failed, right? That's the silhouette of the ruler. The silhouette of the image of God is the one who fails at the tree, right? Either he follows and listens to Torah, or he really bunks it up and doesn't, right? That's why the story of Jesus is a flip on the expectation, right? And so here we are. We begin to interpret a textual world in light of something that the author might not have been considering. And this has been a danger in biblical studies, is knowing, am I getting too much information and the information is no longer helpful, right? Or is this helpful information? This is actually a difficult thing to nail down in biblical studies. When am I importing something that the author didn't want me to know, right? Or when am I actually under-importing what the author wanted me to know, right? Because if I was supposed to know if I was supposed to know any of that stuff, maybe the author would have fit it into the story for me to know, right? That's the challenge. It's one of the great challenges of interpreting Hebrew Bible, is knowing how to navigate the kinds of questions like that. So Sailhammer takes a pretty principled line here, where he thinks ancient Near Eastern backgrounds don't have as much to offer as people think they do. That's actually a hot take. It's a minority position, right? And I respect that. But I have come to differ from my teacher, John Sailhammer, right? I differ with him here. Because I think I have found so many elements of the Hebrew language formally and the culture of the biblical authors, I find that the need for them to be illuminated by the background, right? But I do it in order of influence, right? What I first read is I try to imagine as if none of the background exists. What's the you might call it, the plain read, right? If I didn't have any background and all I had was the English, what is the basic through line of the story, right? I first try to imagine it as if none of the background exists for me to look at, right? And everything is right here within the language of the text itself. And then everything that I need to know to understand the text is inside the text. That's the first layer. And then sometimes, and which happens a lot, is that I'm at a total loss. The text is not helpful in helping me understand it. And something else is absolutely going on. And then the cultural background, can help illuminate, right? It's like in those law enforcement procedural TV shows where they're looking and it goes computer and hands, right? So we're just honing in, right? It's not an art. It is an art, not a science, to do this, right? We have to try and see what fits. But this distinction has been very helpful for me to try and see the first pass reading and then look at what backgrounds I can then interpret. Because we do this all the time. When I ask something in the Old Testament, who are they talking about? What is this prophecy about? And some of us go straight to Jesus. But we have to imagine Old Testament authors didn't know who Jesus was, right? So they were expecting somebody before Jesus was a clear picture, right? Jesus fits into the slot, absolutely. And Jesus is portrayed to fit into the slot. But as good readers of the Hebrew Bible, we have to wait a little bit, right? We have to recognize that Jesus is the one who fits into that silhouette that has been written in the Hebrew Bible. And that Jesus, not that Jesus was a person and then they wrote the Old Testament to be about him, right? It's a very helpful distinction. Thoughts and questions that this might raise, right? We've actually entertained some of the challenging issues with biblical narrative. What are some of the issues that might have been raised, or some helpful thoughts or questions? Some people might ask about the accuracy of the text, right? What we mean by accuracy is like, I want to hit here, did I hit it, right? How do we look at accuracy of the text in light of all of this? For example, when sometimes I might be telling a story with a good friend of mine. I have a friend named Toby. He's one of my best friends. And we have done a lot of life together. But when we meet a third person, sometimes they don't know either of us as well as Toby and I know each other. So we tell them a story. And so I'll say, well, one time we were here at this coffee shop, and then we saw this guy come in, and then he was saying all of these things, and then Toby says, no, that's not how it happened, right? And I get so engrossed in telling the story that I'm trying to tell this person, and then all of a sudden Toby's correcting me on how it actually went down, right? But the thing is, I'm trying to tell my story, not Toby's story, right? And so when Toby corrects me on the details of my story, the details were not the point of my story, right? The point of my story was the ridiculous thing that this person ended up saying. It doesn't matter how they walked in or what they were wearing, not to me at least, right? And so that's when I go like, I know that's not how it happened, but that's not the point. The point is that this person is making a huge scene in front of this croissant, right? And it's ridiculous. The point isn't what they were wearing, right? But you see how for that person, for Toby, it might be more important to emphasize what this person was wearing, how ridiculous he looked, not just how ridiculous he was behaving.
So like the Gospels, right?
Yeah,
If you look at the Gospels, how many women are there, right?
it varies, yeah.
It varies, right? And I think that is the point that you're saying. To some, at least from Mark's perspective, the number of the women are not important. But there were women.
Yeah,
Not unlike John, they named them all. Mary, the mother of Cleopas, Mary,
Yeah.
the mother of Magdalene, blah, blah, blah.
yeah, exactly. And so when we're trying to wrestle with narrative differences, it's helpful to recognize that people have different ways of telling the same story to emphasize different things. And in normal, regular life, it's not an issue, right? That's not usually the issue, as long as you can hold the unity together. If you can grab the point and the purpose of the author. And so it's in a sense, in maybe Toby's, it's a huge admission on my part to recognize, yeah, you're right, it didn't happen that way, right? But that wasn't the point of my story, right? And we have to recognize that. So he's right, but also I was correct. I'm also right? And so the correction is inappropriate in some sense because you're ruining the story that I'm trying to tell, right? If my point was to represent factually to the detail what happened, then in one sense I would be failing. But I wasn't trying to recount word for word. I didn't say, and the pressure in the room changed by three ticks on the barometer. Right? I'm not trying to represent that level of detail, right? I'm doing bigger picture stuff, right? So you understand, right? The differences in narrative don't often mean that the accuracy of what's being told is lessened.
Can you comment on, I don't know if they know, can you comment on the woman caught in adultery?
You mean like about the text?
No, not just, why is it, it wasn't mentioned, it's a footnote in some of.
Okay, sure. So this gets into a textual issue. So some manuscripts don't contain the story of the woman caught in adultery, meaning that some representations of the events actually don't have this story in it, right? Actually, the earliest editions don't contain it, right? So the earliest edition means closest to the event, which for a lot of actual more conservative Protestant scholars, the historicity is the thing we're focusing on, which is why in an ESV, which is primarily conservative Bible scholars, they put it in a footnote, right? Because that's a concern for them to represent the earliest form of the text is what's in your book. And then in the footnotes are going to be things that appeared in many but later texts, right? And so that's an issue that we have to deal with. You might say, so then did Jesus not say that thing? It's like the material of the story is from somewhere, right? And it's in line with a kind of person that Jesus has been portrayed in the earliest texts. You can imagine Jesus saying similar things in other locations, right? Right? And when we were talking about the New Testament, we talked about how these are quilt pieces being assembled. And every gospel is an assemblage of the quilt pieces. And some people have different sources, right? And so these are the things that a good Bible reader will know how to wrestle with, right? That might be driving you crazy. Yeah, go ahead.
So is it
Yeah. What we need to catch is that we want to say that the Bible is an unbiased perspective. It's absolutely not. It is a biased perspective. It was collected to be a biased book to tell you a story that they were fully believing, right? That's the Bible. To try and call it an unbiased text is to reduce the Bible to a history textbook that was trying to give you CCTV footage. But the purpose of the Tanakh is absolutely to say, hey, the whole human project got derailed, but God didn't let go. He didn't stop. He's still here. Look at all the points in the story where he could have let go, right? Where he could have stopped, but he didn't. And his solution at the end of Tanakh is, oh my goodness, when will it happen? Which the New Testament is the answer to. This is how God does the thing. This is how the story gets back on track. So to try and say that you need to read it objectively, it's a strange question, because the Bible is not an objective text. It's the first 4 books of the New Testament are subjective tellings of Jesus' narrative, right? And then some of them get fast and loose with the events, right? There's the temple clearing at the beginning of John, but everywhere else it's at the end. And some people say, well, there's 2 temple clearings. Or maybe the gospel authors didn't care when it happened. The point was that it happened. And you're missing the point. That's Jesus, right? That's the point, right? And so for us as a task, when I read the text as a scholar, I'm reading it literarily. I'm reading it also historically, right? But I'm also a Christian. So I'm reading it theologically, right? In a way that an atheist cannot read it, right? And so this is our task, not to try and pretend that I'm not reading it theologically. I absolutely am. I have a dog in the fight. But what we need to do is be honest about all of the things that come to the table and what all I bring to the table when I read, right? It's like, you know this, when you're maybe out in public in the Philippines and a missionary comes and sits next to you and tries to witness to you in the gospel. They didn't even ask you a question. They don't know anything about you. They didn't ask you where you came from, whether you go to church already. They just assume you're a sinner. They need to tell you that you're going to hell and that you should probably get saved. Thank you, goodbye, right? That's a model to do it. But it really certainly helps. And they do it under the pretense of, I'm not trying to do anything here, but we know that they are. And so for us, that's the task, to just be honest from the get-go. And there's all these ways we deceive ourselves into trying to be, quote-unquote, objective readers, but we are readers with a bias by the sheer fact that I don't exist everywhere, right? I will always be a 21st century reader. I cannot pretend to be a 20th century reader, right? The world that formed me and shaped my perspective is not the same one that saw World War II happen, right? That's different. The concerns are different, right? And so, right? So that really we just have to get honest, right? And so the biblical world, the world of biblical narrative opens up for us a whole new world, really. And truly, right? And any other questions before we wrap this up? I know that this is a lot of information to kind of contend with, right? So here,
what you're saying is that also words means a lot, right?
words mean a lot. But if you recall, yeah.
That's when you read, especially in Arabic, right?
Yeah, and so I remember having a conversation with, I forget who it was in my family, but I tried to tell them that words don't mean anything, actually, right? What is a word when it's spoken? Be as crass as possible. It is my vocal cords flapping and making sound waves and air make a sound. And when I hear that sound, depending on who hears it, they will recognize it as a word or not, right? If I go up to somebody in France and I say, sup or something like that, Or I go to Thailand and say sup. That same sound could be a word in Thai, right? But in English, it's a shortening of what is up, right? So words on their own don't mean a thing, but people mean things by words, right? And if people mean things by words when they're written down, somebody meant something here. If it doesn't occur to me what it means, I've got work to do. I've got homework. And so that thing might drive a reader crazy, and it's why reading is a difficult task, right? We intuitively know that it's difficult to catch people's drift, right? Which is why you might hear preachers go, "Are you tracking with me?" Or like, "Do you hear me?" Or, "You get me, right?" And we might say, like, in the middle of a conversation, "So I was going to this school, right? You get it? Cool. Keep going," right? Because if I blaze through and you actually miss me 4 points ago, by the time you get to my 5th point, it's nonsense, right? And so we do this all the time. So here's where we'll close. Our challenge is that people differ, and our standards for how we use words and how we read words and hear words and catch meaning differs, right? So even more so when our culture differs, right? Even generationally, how we use the same word might change. Have you heard this word? I might have given you this example. Egregious. So it's a word, it's a kind of fancier word. It's maybe a little old-timey, out of date. But the word egregious, what does it mean? Somebody. SAT people. Like, that was an egregious offense. Right? Like, basically, it's like an overwhelmingly bad thing. That's egregious. Like, yeah, like, exactly. We mean it by like, "Oh my God, that's so bad." That's what we mean by it. Right? Egregious on its own is just a sound with a lot of G's in it, right? But you and I, when we have the same language and we have the same understanding of it, you know that it's really bad. Even if you didn't know what the word egregious meant, and I said, they did an egregiously awful thing to me, you get what I mean, right? I don't need to know what egregious means to know that somebody did you wrong in a big way. You could tell by tone, you could tell by the other words that I used, you could tell by how distraught I am. The word egregious is immaterial at that point. But here's the thing. Egregious in the 21st century means something. What did it mean 50 years ago? 50 years ago, egregious meant the complete opposite. It changed in meaning in 50 years. You can look at or maybe more than 50 years, maybe 100. Yeah, you can see it change. Egregious used to mean really, really good. It actually comes from the same root as gregarious, which is like, wow, what a nice, effusively kind and talkative person, right? So he's egregious. Good. It's the same as, man, that thing is bad, but I mean it's good, right? Or that thing is so sick, and I don't mean it's ill, which also means cool, right? Right? So, right? You see how language is really fluid, and it really depends on where we're hearing it, right? Nothing for it, but you and I cannot ignore the change of meaning in words over time in the biblical text, right? We have to face it head on. We can continue to ignore it, but then have really strange readings, right? Especially when it comes to events that are covered from multiple texts, like the Gospels, right? And these texts, like the 4 Gospels, raise this issue in a huge way, and you cannot ignore it, that the words mean things, and they mean different things by words, because each Gospel author has an idiolect, right? Their own manner of speaking, right? So this is the foundation narrative of our faith, given by 4 vantage points. The Jesus story in 4 different shapes, and they differ in details. And the challenge is that we don't often have the same event from multiple perspectives. So somebody's telling a story and we don't have corroborating evidence, right? We just have it from one. And in the Hebrew Bible, we don't have the same thing as the Gospels. Very rarely you get to hear, like, the book of Jonah tells us the story of whom? Jonah and the Ninevites, right? Jonah and the Ninevites, who are Assyrians. Do we have any other reporting of Jonah in the Old Testament? There's only one location. There's one location where you get just in passing. Another prophet, Amos, comes and tells the king, you listen to Jonah? He's awful. He's lying to you. That's it. Jonah told you, this king, what you wanted to hear. I've been sent from the fields. He's wrong. That's the only other time we hear about Jonah, right? And so there we go. The challenge for us in the Hebrew Bible is that we only get one perspective most of the times, right? It's a real issue. And I want to bring this example here, and this is where we'll close, just so that we can see if we understand where it's about. We're going to talk about Noah and the flood. It's an event. What is the event? It's the flood, right? And now we have what's written here in the text, in the book of Genesis. It is a perspective of what is going on at this event, which is the flood, right? Now, it doesn't mean that what is written is exactly what happened, because what is written is actually not what happened. It is a representation of what happened, right? We're practicing. Because I used to think of it growing up, and I'm pretty sure many Christians were raised in this way. When they read that scripture, they think of God telling the author, this is what happened. This is what happened in the text. Write it down exactly as I say it. And then they write it down exactly as they say it. And so by asking a question of the text, ultimately you're questioning God because God told the person to write it, right? But we've put quite some distance between us and that in the first semester, right? That each author has a perspective, they have a purpose, they have a writing style. Some of them are a little bit more floral than others. Some people are not, right? Think of and how it happened. So we get into the story of Genesis in the flood, and you go 2 animals of every species in the ark. And then if you ask one question, but dinosaurs are big. Dinosaurs are really big. And then some solutions will have, well, dinosaurs died out way before then. Or actually, God only made fossils. There's a lot of ways to try and make it work, because if the goal is to make it work, then you have to do all these contortions to make it work. But if that was never the point, then we're missing the point, right? And so my question is the point of the event to figure out if every animal species could fit in the ark? No, right? Because it's possible that the dimensions mean something else for the rest of the Tanakh. There's possible that there is a relationship between that and the temple, right? What are the other times we get measurements in the Bible? Temple, tabernacle, Ezekiel's temple. Revelation, right? Clearly temple narratives, right? So if we're asking the wrong question, we'll never get around to asking the right ones, right? And so my question is, that's not the point of the event, to figure out which animals fit in the ark. That's not the most important point, at least, right? Like the story doesn't hinge on whether or not there really was every animal in the ark, right? Even cockroaches and every kind of cockroach, right? Right? Every kind, the big ones and the small ones and the ones that live under the sink. Yeah, even the ladybugs, and there's the yellow ladybugs. Do the albinos count, right? We start getting into that question, it's beside the point, right, of how it happened, right? In the history of Israel, what matters is not really those details, right? Because again, they're written by a human, and what we have is their perspective in representing an event, right? But the thing that they're trying to represent and show you is the meaning of these things. The significance of God remembering Noah and planting him on another mountain, just like Eden, then putting him on a garden, and he plants a vineyard. And then we have, oh wait, we're starting over with a new Adam, and it's Noah, and there's a garden? Wow, we get to start over. What will he do? Will he fail at the tree or not fail at the tree? What does he do? He fails at the tree, right? He fails at the tree. And then what does the next person do? He fails at a tree. Abraham, sitting by the tree at the oaks of Mamre, right? And then his son Isaac brings what? A tree up a mountain. Again, like a new Adam. Does he do it? Through fear and trembling, he almost kills his son, right? Right? So we're meant to ask the meanings of these things. Why are these words here? right? Not to be like, this word is here, what kind of tree was it though? Was it really a tree? Was it a live tree? Because living tree doesn't burn as well as dead tree, right? Wrong questions, right? And so this is the task, to try and balance the two priorities, right? These authors, think of the quilt, they want to pass on what they have received, but they also want to highlight how each little episode fits into the quilt and into the pattern. And they're going to use literary techniques of repetition and design and symmetry and techniques of characterization and plot developments to shape the narratives into the quilt and the patterns. And they're doing both, right? But they're not primarily trying to recreate the world that they experienced. They're trying to interpret it for you and show you the thing that you should catch, right? If you go and read Exodus, the story of Exodus, and all you get is, wow, parted seas, that's cool. Then you miss the part where Moses fails in every respect as a prophet because he couldn't hold his temper at the rock, right? He was said, God told him, speak to the rock. But the people were noisy. He said, shut up, and he hit the rock. And then God says, you can't come now. You've ruined it, right? So that's the meaning, right? Moses is being characterized, right? So if you were standing there, you would know all the details, at least the ones you could notice, right? But we are not standing there. We experience the representation that is built into it, interpretation, right? So this is the key thing for the rest of our study of narrative here, is that we need to recognize the distance between you and me to the events that we're talking about. And the thing that mediates us, one is the Holy Spirit, obviously, but the text, right? And our goal for this class is not to theologize, but to read the text well. That's it. It sounds simple, and the task is simple enough, and it's difficult because it's that simple, right? So you and I are just starting the journey, right? We looked at the two pictures, that's the task. Any questions before we close?
It's kind of like, sometimes we come across where we like the icing.
Yeah, sure. We appreciate the wrong thing for too long, right? We focus in on the thing. It's like if you've ever been at a movie or something, and you're watching this movie on the big screen, and you see something nice in the corner, but you miss the action that's happening because you were focused on the thing in the corner, right? You're going to have to rewatch it and then watch both, right? And that's our task, right? The flood narrative is such a wonderful example of this because there are other stories from the Israelites' neighbors about floods. So you can look at all of the comparisons,